Alcatraz World's Deadliest Inmates and Gang Secrets Exposed. All information presented is based on verified public sources including U.S. Marshals Service reports, Department of Justice archives, FBI case files, National Park Service records, and credible investigations from History Channel, National Geographic, and the San Francisco Chronicle. The Fortress in the Fog. They called it the Rock. Not because of its shape, but because of its defiance. Rising from the cold, unforgiving waters of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was built to be the end of the line, the place where hope was meant to drown. From 1934 to 1963, this island fortress held some of the most dangerous men America ever produced. Mobsters, bank robbers, gang leaders, and escape artists who had outwitted every other prison they had known. Alcatraz was designed not for rehabilitation, but for control. According to Department of Justice records, it was where the government sent inmates deemed unmanageable, men who caused chaos in Leavenworth, Atlanta, or McNeil Island. If mainland prisons were farms, Alcatraz was a laboratory, an experiment in absolute isolation. A prison born from fear. When the Great Depression hit, America saw a rise in violent crime, from Prohibition-era bootlegging to organized gang empires. Figures like Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, became folk legends, symbols of rebellion during hard times. But their fame also humiliated federal authorities. In 1933, the Bureau of Prisons proposed a new kind of institution, a maximum security, minimum privilege penitentiary that no one could escape and few could endure. The location was perfect, an island surrounded by freezing currents and shark-infested waters, just over a mile from San Francisco's glittering skyline. According to archival plans, the prison's design featured 4 tiers of concrete cell blocks, thick steel doors, and guard towers equipped with machine guns. Every hallway could be sealed with a single switch. Alcatraz wasn't just meant to hold men, it was meant to break them. The island had once served as a Civil War fortress, but by the 1930s, it was transformed into a high-tech dungeon. Water, food, and even clothing were rationed. Communication was controlled down to the number of words a man could say. Prison policy referred to this as silent discipline. For some, silence was worse than chains. Arrival on the Rock. The journey to Alcatraz began with the sound of chains. Every inmate arrived aboard a prison transport ship, wrists cuffed, ankles shackled, and minds heavy with dread. According to official intake procedures, new prisoners were stripped, searched, and marched single file through what was known as Broadway, the main corridor dividing the cell blocks. Guards lined the upper levels, rifles trained downward. No one spoke. The air smelled of salt and disinfectant. Inmate orientation was brutally simple. Rule 1: obey every order. Rule 2: there are no other rules. Each man received a small bundle: uniform, blanket, towel, soap, and a tin cup. His number was etched into everything. His name no longer mattered. According to an account from former Warden James A. Johnston, prisoners were not permitted to speak unless spoken to. Meals were eaten in silence, exercise was limited to 1 hour in the yard, and letters from family were read and censored line by line. Even the architecture enforced obedience, with narrow walkways and open bars designed to let guards monitor every move. The cells themselves measured only 5 by 9 feet, just large enough for a cot, a sink, and a toilet. Privacy was non-existent, dignity optional. The men who ruled the shadows. Among the hundreds who passed through Alcatraz, a few names became legend. Al Capone, the Chicago mob boss, arrived in 1934, the prison's first true celebrity inmate. Once untouchable, he now scrubbed floors and played banjo in the prison band, the Rock Islanders. His days of commanding empires were reduced to counting spoons in the mess hall. According to reports, Capone's mind began to deteriorate after years of untreated syphilis. Guards noted him talking to himself, staring at walls for hours, or playing the same tune over and over on his banjo. The king of organized crime had been reduced to a ghost of routine. Another inmate, George Machine Gun Kelly, tried to maintain his legend, boasting that he'd someday walk free. But guards found him quiet and withdrawn after a few years. The isolation crushed his bravado faster than any sentence could. Then there was Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman. Contrary to Hollywood's myth, Stroud never kept birds at Alcatraz. The privilege had been stripped from him when he was transferred from Leavenworth. But he remained a scholar of isolation, reading legal texts, writing essays, and challenging the system that confined him. He lived decades in near-total solitude, his intellect both a gift and a curse. And beneath these famous names were hundreds of others, men forgotten by history, whose stories never made headlines. Burglars turned killers, enforcers turned ghosts. Together, they formed an underworld of whispers, a secret society of survival. Discipline by design. The system of control at Alcatraz was relentless. Every hour of the day was accounted for. Wake up at 6:30 a.m. Breakfast at 7 o'clock, black coffee, oatmeal, maybe one slice of toast. Work assignments in the laundry, kitchen, or factory. Lunch at noon. Lockdown at 4:30. Even Sundays, the so-called day of rest, were marked by silence and inspection. Guards performed random cell checks, counting spoons, razors, and sanity. Punishment was swift. For talking out of turn, an inmate could lose yard time. For disobedience, he could face the hole, a pitch-black cell in D Block, where men were kept for days in total darkness. According to former inmate accounts, the hole had no mattress, no toilet, and no sound. Some inmates claimed to hear voices. Others described hallucinations so vivid they could no longer tell waking from sleep. Psychologists who later reviewed the records compared the effects to sensory deprivation experiment. It was, in many ways, a war on the mind. Even guards began to feel the island's psychological weight. In interviews decades later, several officers confessed to hearing phantom footsteps or seeing shapes move across the fog at night, though most chalked it up to exhaustion and nerve. For both sides of the bars, Alcatraz was more than a prison. It was an experiment in control, of behavior, of identity, of spirit. Whispers of defiance. But even here, resistance found its voice. By the 1940s, small alliances began to form among inmates, quiet friendships between men who refused to be erased. In the dining hall, they learned to communicate through glances and taps of spoons. In the laundry rooms, coded messages were etched into soap or stitched into uniforms. According to Bureau of Prisons documents, several gangs from the mainland began infiltrating the population, primitive versions of groups that would later dominate American prisons: white protection cliques, Latino alliances, and early black resistance group. Though rudimentary, these brotherhoods shared one purpose: to survive the system by creating their own. Guards noticed tattoos appearing despite the bans. A simple symbol could mean allegiance, a pattern of scars could mark a silent war. By the early 1950s, these factions had begun negotiating with one another, trading cigarettes, favors, and silence. Power was shifting. Even on the Rock, control was never absolute. The cost of silence. Life on Alcatraz wasn't just hard, it was calculated to be hopeless. Inmates could see the lights of San Francisco across the water at night, a constant reminder of the world they'd lost. Some said that was the cruelest punishment of all, being able to see freedom but never touch it. Over time, the isolation wore down even the strongest men. Mental breakdowns were common. Records from the 1950s described multiple suicide attempts each year. Hangings, poisonings, even men who drowned themselves during work detail by stepping into the bay with shackled feet. When guards retrieved their bodies, the water was so cold their skin turned blue within minutes. Still, no one spoke about it. The rule of silence remained. Alcatraz's greatest weapon was not the bars, nor the guards, nor the guns, it was hopelessness. And yet, within that hopelessness, seeds of defiance continued to grow. The escape dream. Every prisoner dreamed of one thing: escape. Most knew it was impossible. But impossibility has never stopped men from trying. According to official records, 36 inmates attempted escape during the prison's 29 years of operation. All but a few were either recaptured, killed, or confirmed drowned. But the idea persisted that maybe, just maybe, someone could beat the rock. Among the guards, the saying went, "You can leave Alcatraz when your time or your body's up." Yet somewhere in the shadows, plans were already forming. Blueprints drawn on stolen napkins, soap molds shaped into keys, raincoats hoarded and stitched into makeshift raft. A rebellion was taking form, silent, patient, invisible. And by the early 1960s, that rebellion would culminate in an event that shook the entire nation. The night Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers vanished. The Great Escape, the night the rock fell silent. The year was 1962. Alcatraz had been operating for nearly 3 decades, long enough to forge its own legends, and long enough for men to start believing that even the impossible could be done. For years, the prison had been called escape-proof, a title reinforced by the brutal waters surrounding the island. But on the night of June 11, 1962, that reputation would crack, quietly, methodically, and without a single guard noticing until it was far too late. It began in cell block B, inside 3 adjacent cells that seemed as ordinary as any other. Inside those cells were Frank Morris and brothers Clarence and John Anglin, career criminals, bank robbers, and escape artists whose determination would soon make them infamous. According to official FBI and Bureau of Prisons reports, the 3 men, along with a 4th accomplice, Alan West, spent months engineering one of the most daring escapes in American history. The mastermind. Frank Lee Morris had been born into poverty and had spent most of his life behind bars. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, he had already escaped from the Louisiana State Penitentiary, a feat that earned him both respect and suspicion from inmates and staff alike. Intelligent, quiet, and observant, Morris was said to have an IQ of 133, far above average, especially in a place built on violence and brute strength. He studied patterns, guard rotations, work schedules, and the faint hum of the ventilators that ran through the concrete walls. The Anglin brothers, hailing from rural Georgia, were different, strong, resourceful, and fiercely loyal to one another. They had grown up working on farms and learned to swim in cold Michigan rivers, a detail that would later prove crucial. Transferred to Alcatraz after multiple escape attempts from other prisons, they were, in the words of a former warden, born with the wrong kind of imagination. Alan West, the 4th man, was the one who first noticed the structural flaw, a vent cover in his cell wall that could be removed with enough patience and determination. Behind it lay a maintenance corridor, narrow and unguarded, running behind the entire cell block. It was the artery of the prison, and the one thing no one had thought could be breached. The secret workshop. The plan began with dust. Every night after lights out, the 4 men chipped away at the vent openings using makeshift tools, metal spoons stolen from the mess hall and sharpened screwdrivers taken from the prison workshop. They disguised the sound by timing it with the roar of music during recreation hours or the clang of machinery. When guards passed by, each hole was concealed with a painted cardboard grill that matched the wall's color perfectly. According to FBI photographs later released, the openings were just large enough for a man to squeeze through. Once inside the maintenance corridor, the men created a secret workshop atop the cell block, accessible through a vent shaft. There, they worked for months in total secrecy, using stolen materials to build a raft and life vests from over 50 raincoats stitched together with thread and glue made from melted floor wax. Their creativity bordered on genius. The raft could be inflated with a stolen concertina, a small accordion used in the prison band, modified to pump air. They even fashioned paddles from scrap wood and bolts, binding them with electrical wire stripped from old fans. Each night, the men carried materials up piece by piece, hiding them behind a false wall in the crawlspace. To avoid detection during nightly bed checks, they created dummy heads, sculpted from soap, toilet paper, and real human hair collected from the prison barbershop. The heads were painted with flesh-colored paint made from stolen art supplies and glued with homemade adhesive. When guards shone flashlights into their cells at night, they saw what looked like sleeping men, perfectly still, perfectly human. Life in the shadows. Every detail of the plan was rehearsed for months. They timed the guards' rounds, memorized the sound of footsteps, and kept notes on every weak point in the system. The tension grew daily. One slip, one wrong sound could mean solitary confinement, or worse. Frank Morris was the architect, the one who calculated the tides and mapped escape routes based on old maintenance blueprints. The Anglin brothers handled the raft construction and stored food supplies: chocolate bars, canned beans, and a few stolen spoons. West mixed soap, toothpaste, and ashes to sculpt the dummy heads, a grotesque art that would one day fool an entire prison staff. Yet, the plan wasn't without risk. According to prison records, the ventilation shafts were full of razor-sharp metal edges and corroded bolts. More than once, the men sliced their arms open trying to squeeze through. They used stolen medical tape to patch themselves up. They never sought help from the infirmary. Any report of injury could expose their secret. Inmates in nearby cells occasionally heard strange noises, scraping, whispering, the faint smell of glue. But in Alcatraz, curiosity was dangerous. Everyone knew that silence was safer than involvement. No one reported a thing. The night of June 11, 1962. By early summer, the plan was ready. Morris and the Anglins waited for the perfect moment, a quiet night when the guards' shifts overlapped and fog covered the bay. That night, they removed the vent covers, slipped into the corridor, and climbed up the plumbing shaft toward the roof. Each movement was deliberate, each breath could betray them. Below, guards patrolled with flashlights, unaware that the most infamous escape in U.S. history was unfolding just meters above their heads. Alan West, however, wasn't so lucky. According to his later testimony, the cement around his vent had hardened faster than expected. By the time he managed to break through, the others were gone. He screamed into the darkness, but no one came. For hours, he sat there, staring through the hole, realizing he was now both an accomplice and a prisoner of his own delay. Meanwhile, Morris and the Anglins made it onto the roof. They used a utility pipe to climb down the side of the building, carrying their homemade raft and life vest. At the shoreline, they inflated the raft using the modified concertina and launched it into the black water at approximately 10:30 p.m. What happened next remains one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. The aftermath. By morning, guards discovered the empty cells. At first, they thought the men were asleep. When one officer nudged a sleeping Morris and the dummy head rolled onto the floor, panic erupted. Sirens wailed across the island. Searchlights swept the yard, the cliffs, the water. Helicopters scoured the bay. But the men were gone. The escape triggered one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. FBI agents combed through the coastline, pulling debris, life vests, and paddles from the water. A makeshift paddle was found near Angel Island. A wallet containing photos of the Anglins' relatives was discovered floating near the Golden Gate Bridge, though its origin was never conclusively proven. For weeks, newspapers across the country ran headlines declaring "No one escapes the rock." Until now. Public fascination grew. Had they drowned in the frigid currents, or had they reached freedom? The official FBI investigation, which lasted 17 years, concluded that the men most likely perished in the bay. But not everyone agreed. Theories and shadows. Over the decades, new evidence continued to surface. According to a 2013 U.S. Marshals Service report, investigators received a letter allegedly written by John Anglin, claiming that he and his brother had survived the escape and lived in secret for decades. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. No body was ever recovered. No confirmed sighting was made. To this day, the case remains open. The Anglin family, in interviews with the History Channel and National Geographic, maintained that the brothers had survived, even showing photographs of two elderly men in Brazil who bore striking resemblance to them. Experts remain divided. Some say it's a hoax. Others believe the impossible happened, that the rock had finally been beaten. The unseen hand. While the escape captivated the public, what few realized was how it exposed the inner workings of Alcatraz, the silent communication networks, the coded alliances, and the underground ingenuity of its inmates. According to declassified Bureau of Prisons documents, guards later discovered a network of secret cooperation among prisoners from different backgrounds, white, black, and Latino, who had quietly assisted the escape by providing tools, fabric, and lookout signals. This wasn't just an act of defiance, it was unity against a system built to divide. Even within the strictest environment in America, humanity had found a way to rebel. But it also terrified the authorities. If inmates could organize across races and gangs under such isolation, then no prison was truly secure. Within a year, reports from congressional oversight committees began citing Alcatraz as obsolete, inhumane, and economically unsustainable. The rock's legend had turned against itself. The closing walls. By 1963, Alcatraz was finished. The infrastructure was failing, the costs were enormous, and the political appetite for such a brutal institution had faded. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy signed the order to close the penitentiary permanently. The island was abandoned, its cells empty, its halls echoing with the ghosts of discipline and defiance. Yet, the legacy of that night, June 11, 1962, never faded. It became a symbol of human resilience, men so desperate for freedom they built it piece by piece, spoon by spoon, in the face of impossible odds. Even today, as tourists walk through the cold corridors and listen to the echoing footsteps of history, some pause at the 3 empty cells in Block B. The holes in the walls remain, patched but visible, silent reminders of the night the rock was outsmarted. Some say when the fog rolls in and the wind howls through the bars, you can still hear the faint creak of paddles on water. Whether they lived or died, one truth remains. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers did what no one else could. They made Alcatraz bleed. The afterlife of the rock. What really happened after the gates closed? When the last guard turned his key in 1963, Alcatraz didn't die, it went silent. The island stood there, cold and defiant, surrounded by restless tides that had claimed so many dreams before. For nearly 3 decades, Alcatraz had symbolized ultimate punishment, a place where the nation's worst offenders were buried alive behind stone. But once the cells emptied, a different story began, one that blurred the line between history and myth, fact and folklore. The ghosts left behind. After the official closure, the federal government left Alcatraz abandoned. Reports describe the halls as echoing with the sound of wind through rusted bars, seagulls nesting in the guard towers, and the lingering scent of disinfectant. The paint peeled, the walls cracked, and the silence deepened. But some who returned years later, former guards, maintenance crews, and later, park rangers, claimed that silence wasn't empty. They spoke of sounds that had no source. The clatter of cell doors at night, faint music from the old prison bandroom, the echo of boots pacing a corridor where no one stood. None of it was officially documented, but all of it fed into the legend. Even hardened guards who once laughed at inmates' superstitions admitted that the island had a presence, something cold and observing. Whether those were echoes of memory or imagination hardly mattered. The rock had taken on a life of its own. The myths of escape. Long after the investigation closed, new clues continued to surface, fragments that kept the question alive. Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survive? According to FBI Case File 17 AP015, the official stance was clear. The men drowned in the bay, their bodies carried out to sea. But the absence of evidence, no remains, no conclusive debris, left room for doubt. In 1965, a Norwegian freighter reported spotting a floating body wearing denim clothing 20 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge. The currents made the claim plausible, but by the time authorities arrived, the body was gone. Unconfirmed, never verified. Years later, in 1979, a San Francisco detective received an unsigned postcard postmarked from Brazil. It contained only 2 words: "The Rock Lives." Investigators dismissed it as a hoax. But in 2013, the U.S. Marshals Service received a handwritten letter allegedly from John Anglin. It read, "Yes, we made it that night. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I want one thing, to tell you the truth before I go." The handwriting matched. DNA tests on the envelope were inconclusive. No follow-up evidence was found. The file remains open, more than 60 years later. According to National Geographic's 2015 forensic reconstruction, tidal simulations suggested that the men could have reached Angel Island if they launched their raft at precisely 11:30 p.m., as the tide shifted north. Too early or too late, and they would have been dragged under. Even now, experts can't agree whether the plan was madness or a masterpiece. A nation obsessed. By the 1970s, Alcatraz had become something else entirely, a national obsession. Hollywood turned it into myth, with films like Escape from Alcatraz, 1979, immortalizing the daring breakout and transforming Frank Morris into a folk hero. Tourists began chartering boats just to glimpse the island, long before it was reopened to the public. Then, in 1972, the U.S. Congress designated Alcatraz Island as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, placing it under the care of the National Park Service. When it reopened to the public, thousands poured in: journalists, historians, families, and thrill seekers. They wanted to walk the same corridors, to peer into the same cells, to feel the same chill that had haunted so many. Guides reported that visitors often fell silent in cell block D, the hole, where the darkness feels thicker than air itself. Some tourists swear they hear breathing or footsteps in the dark. Others describe a feeling of being watched. No one has ever explained it fully. But perhaps that's the point. Alcatraz's power lies not in what is seen, but in what is remembered. The forgotten men. While tourists marveled at the legends of Capone and Morris, the reality of the lesser-known inmates faded away. Men like Henry Young, whose case inspired the 1947 film Brute Force, was sentenced for bank robbery but later convicted of killing a fellow inmate inside Alcatraz. Court records revealed that Young's violence wasn't born of rage, but of desperation. Months in solitary had driven him to the edge of madness. Others, like Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the Harlem crime boss, served quietly, surviving his sentence with discipline and dignity before returning to New York. For every famous inmate, there were 100 others who lived and died without notice, buried not in the bay, but in the anonymity of the federal record book. Even today, historians continue to uncover case files detailing forgotten lives: a prisoner who spent 15 years in silence after killing a guard, another who taught himself law and helped appeal other inmates' sentences, a man who built miniature ships out of soap just to keep his sanity. These were the true faces of Alcatraz, not just monsters, but men trapped between violence and survival. The politics of punishment. By the 1960s, Alcatraz's downfall wasn't just about cost, it was about conscience. Reports from the Department of Justice cited deteriorating conditions, corroded plumbing, failing heating systems, and the rising expense of shipping food and supplies to the island. But behind those numbers lay a deeper truth. America's image of punishment was changing. Public opinion had shifted. The nation no longer saw cruelty as control. Alcatraz, once a symbol of strength, had become a monument to failure. When the prison closed, more than 250 inmates were transferred to other federal facilities. Some adapted, others didn't. A few carried the psychological scars of the rock for the rest of their lives. Prison psychiatrists later described a phenomenon they called Alcatraz syndrome, a lingering sense of paranoia and distrust developed under total isolation. Even decades later, former guards reported nightmares of endless corridors and echoing alarms. In the words of one retired officer, "We didn't just guard them. Alcatraz kept us locked up too. The island of many wars." In 1969, 6 years after its closure, Alcatraz became the stage for a very different kind of rebellion. A group of Native American activists calling themselves the Indians of all tribes occupied the island, claiming it as their own territory under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868. They argued that unused federal land should revert to indigenous control. For 19 months they held their ground, painting "Welcome to Indian Land" across the main entrance, raising children on the island, and broadcasting their message to the world. Their occupation ended peacefully in 1971, but it changed history. That protest sparked a national conversation about indigenous rights and the federal government's treatment of Native people. In a strange way, the spirit of defiance that had once driven inmates to escape now fueled a movement for justice. The Rock, once a place of confinement, had become a platform for freedom. Alcatraz today. Today, more than 1 million visitors step onto Alcatraz each year. They walk through corridors where men once counted every second, peer into the cells that held legends, and listen to the chilling audio tours narrated by former inmates and guards. They see the chipped walls, the rusted bars, and the sea beyond, calm, deceptive, endless. But beneath the tourist snapshots lies a deeper message. Alcatraz isn't just a monument to punishment, it's a mirror. It reflects the consequences of power, isolation, and human endurance. It reminds us how far the system can go when control becomes obsession, and how even within those walls, the human spirit still found ways to resist. Some say the Rock still holds its secrets. Maybe the Anglin brothers survived. Maybe they didn't. Maybe Alcatraz itself refuses to let the truth go, content to remain what it always was, an island of mysteries surrounded by silence. Legacy of the Rock. For the American justice system, Alcatraz left a scar and a lesson. Its failure led to reforms in prison management, inmate rights, and psychological health standards across the nation. Its legends inspired books, documentaries, and Hollywood blockbusters, from Birdman of Alcatraz to Escape from Alcatraz and beyond. Each retelling keeps the myth alive, but also raises the same question that haunted the warden's office for decades: what does it truly mean to be free? Was it the men who escaped into the night, risking death for one breath of freedom? Or was it those who stayed behind, who faced their punishment and tried to rebuild from within? In the end, Alcatraz became a symbol not of confinement, but of defiance. It proved that even the strongest walls can't cage the human will forever. Epilogue: The Rock never sleeps. As the ferry pulls away from the island today, visitors often turn back for one last look. The fog rolls over the watchtower, the gulls circle, and the wind carries faint echoes through the corridors. The cells may be empty, but Alcatraz lives on, in every story of rebellion, every fight for justice, and every unanswered question that lingers across the bay. For some, it's a relic. For others, a warning. But for everyone who stands before it, the rock remains what it always was, a monument to the human struggle between control and freedom. And as long as those waters crash against its cliffs, the legend of Alcatraz will never drown. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All information presented is based on verified public sources including U.S. Marshals Service reports, Department of Justice archives, FBI case files, National Park Service records, and credible investigations from History Channel, National Geographic, and the San Francisco Chronicle.